So here we are, we're in chapter 8. And this chapter is going to focus on social conflict, critical criminology, and restorative justice. Now, within this chapter, we do have some theories which are applicable to this particular subject matter. But the way that chapter ends is it brings us to the topic of restorative justice. Now, I will preface this by saying when it comes to restorative justice, it is something very commonly found in the field of victimology. But we know victimology is a subdiscipline of criminology, and that's why it gets lumped into this chapter. So what is a social conflict? Social conflict is the struggle for power in society. In a moment, I'm going to talk about some examples of social conflict. But when we look at power, which is very important to many people in this society, you think about world leaders, you think about some of the most powerful CEOs and businessmen. With respect to social conflict, we are thinking about there being this struggle for power. It's not necessarily something that we as regular people deal with, so to speak, but certainly people with influence, with power, with certain class and esteem, they sometimes have social conflict. Matter of fact, there's a social conflict that's going on right now between a certain tech billionaire and a certain tech billionaire and our president, but we'll leave that one there. Having said that, critical criminologists argue that there's this belief that the cause of crime can be linked to economic, social, and political disparity. If we look at economic, social, and political disparity, we're going to see how in some cases financial or the financial inability to succeed or not having a great financial backing can also tie directly into this. And this inability to achieve a certain level of wealth in the society, which we have some theories which are going to talk about crime and how sometimes people in power will try to keep people down. We'll get to that in a second. But critical criminologists look at crime through a different lens. They don't just see it as black and white, where you got a man over here who is all about robbing people and assaulting people and beating people up and murdering people. They see it as, no, there's clearly something economically wrong with that man for doing that. He has some social deficits. That's why he's doing it. And maybe even a political disparity that could exist as well. And that's what critical criminologists study and look at. So when we talk about social conflict, generally speaking, conflict can be destructive when it leads to war, violence, and death. In some instances, conflict is very functional, especially when it promotes a positive change. Although in some cases, it can be hard to distinguish the two. So look at these images, right? Just for an example. You see right here, this was D-Day, and this was the news that the Nazis had quit. Our country, the United States of America, the Allied powers, that also included included Russia and included Great Britain, and I believe France too. I believe these countries, we were the Allied powers going up against the axis of evil, Germany, Nazi Germany, Italy, fascist Italy, and then, of course, the Empire of Japan. World War II is like no other war that we've ever had in the world and in our history. Maybe some could say the Civil War because it was an internal conflict, but World War II was one of the most inconsequential wars of a lifetime. But you see these images when we think about social change, because Adolf Hitler, one of the most hated men and most reviled men in world history, was essentially out to conquer all of Europe and spread his Nazi beliefs, probably not just in Europe, but even worldwide. And of course, we had this war. And of course, the Germans or the Japanese attacking us on Pearl Harbor and on December 7th. in Pearl Harbor. So when you look at social change, you see these images and you think, okay, yes, the United States had to be involved. We had to go to war. We dropped the atomic bomb. We defeated these evil individuals, and the world got back on track. If this were a political science class, what if we were going to talk about Russia's attacks on Ukraine? What if we were going to talk about whether NATO or even the United States should get more involved in this conflict? Because this has been going on for years. What about Israel's war with Hamas? The key to focus on is sometimes conflict is inevitable. However, in any instance of conflict, one side will feel they're right and the other side will think they're wrong, and vice versa. What I want to leave you with before I move on is, what about pain and suffering? When do we say enough is enough with pain and suffering? Because showing these images, obviously there is pain and suffering here. I can't imagine a whole building being toppled on me or on my family. I couldn't imagine walking through the streets and just seeing the absolute destruction and rubble because of bombs that have fallen. So yes, in some instances, conflict is inevitable, class, but can we take a moment to pause and reflect on pain and suffering? That's just my thought. So conflict promotes crime by creating a social atmosphere in which the law is a mechanism for controlling dissatisfied, have-not members of society, while the wealthy maintain their power. Now, going back to strain theory, remember, I have a bunch of theories that are my favorites. I love rational choice theory. Last chapter, in a previous chapter, social process theory. I love social control theory because, like I said, what are the bonds that keeps me from committing crimes? Well, 1, I'm a professor. 2, I'm former law enforcement. 3, my religion. 4, my family. I mean, I can go on and on. You too have certain bonds that keep you from committing crimes. But I love strain theory too, because remember, strain theory is that branch of social structure theory that sees crime as a function of the conflict between people's goals and the means available to obtain them. In fact, there's anger and frustration felt by the lower class, and they must produce an alternative to achieve their goals. The alternative is usually crime. I want to say that the anger and frustration felt by the lower class is not always felt by the lower class. Middle class, working class people too feel it as well. You see how much eggs cost? A carton of eggs. I was in we have a supermarket called Kroger. I think a carton of eggs or a dozen eggs is still what, $4.99, $5.99, depending on if you go there or you go to Publix. So everything is still very expensive, and it just hurts. With that being said, we see a theory like strain theory creeping into social conflict, and it being a formation or being the foundation rather on where this theory is coming into, or where social conflict is coming into play because of the idea of the haves and have-nots. So contemporary critical criminology, in anything contemporary class, deals with modern times. It focuses on what's happening today. Generally looks at it through the following context: economic and social context for crime, thinking about how when people are economically challenged or they feel like in society you got this wealthy elite over here and we're just forgotten. The people who are making decisions could care less. So we make our own way. The connection between social class crime and social control. Again, what is your class? Are you lower class? Are you poor? Are you middle class? Are you upper class? What about social control? If you're upper class, you make decisions. You have your connections with people who make decisions. Whereas if you're middle class, you want to believe you have a connection with your congressman, with your senator, whatever, but do they really hear you? Will they take your emails? Will they take your calls? The role of government in creating a criminogenic environment. Well, the government does play a role in that, and we'll just, keep moving along. The relationship between personal or group power in shaping criminal law. Again, what are your personal ambitions with respect to criminal law, or are you a part of a group that can make changes? prevalence of a bias in the justice system. We'll talk about bias within the criminal justice system in just a moment, and then the relationship between a capitalistic economy and crime rates. When looking at a capitalistic economy, even though the United States is the freest and most profitable nation in the world, we still have crime. People are still committing crimes. People still feel like they can't get their piece of the American pie or the American dream. So just because we have a capitalistic society and a capitalistic economy does not mean that we don't have crime. Remember, this is the one place, right, where you can wake up, and if you have a business idea and have some acumen to get this idea off the ground and launch, you can be successful. The United States is one of the only places in the world where that can happen. It takes some breaks, it takes some lucks, it takes knowing the right people, getting the right types of grants or loans or whatever. But this is a place where that can happen. So yes, even though we're in a capitalistic economy, we still have crime rates, because while that works for some, it doesn't work for others. So if we want to think about our origins of critical criminology, well, we have to certainly look at this man that's seen in the background. And that man is Karl Marx. Karl Marx believed modern capitalism had turned workers into a dehumanized mass who lived an existence that was at the mercy of their employers. Now, Karl Marx wrote this book right here on the left, along with Frederick Engels, called The Communist Manifesto. Now, you might be saying to yourself, wait a minute, I've seen that symbol. Where have I seen that symbol? Well, that's the symbol of the Soviet Union, which also became known as the USSR, Russia, all that, the sickle and hammer. When looking at critical criminology, Karl Marx felt that we were at the mercy of our employers. Now, many of you students or many of you people that's watching this are probably very young. Some of you might be older. I've had some of my students say they've shared this with their parents, and I got parents tuning in. I'm encouraging you that as you watch these lectures, why I call this professor for the people is because I'm trying to educate people on criminology and criminal justice, a field that really not anybody's really talking about, right? What I hope is that wherever you work, you don't feel like you're at the mercy of your employer. If you work for whatever company or corporation, I hope that you don't feel like you're at the mercy of your employer. Like, put a chain around me and I come to work and I'm marching like I'm in a factory, working like a dog, and I go home to tired and look at my wages and I have meager wages, and then I repeat the cycle. See, Marx had this vision of economic inequality, and it resulted in social conflict that obviously had a profound influence on 20th century thought. In fact, Marx, it seemed like he was ahead of his time. And why he felt this way, as we come back to contemporary critical criminology, is because, first of all, when you look at economic competitiveness, what that does, it increases interpersonal conflict and eventually destabilizes both social institutions and social groups. This shapes the haves and have-nots. We're always going to have the people over here who have and the people who have not. It's just how it works. It's not, I don't want to say it's not fair, but it's just what we have in our society. Another thing, widening gap between the rich and the poor. Remember in social structure theory, that lecture, I talked about how arguably like the two wealthiest men in the world, Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, they have a combined net worth of, however many billions, trillions, whatever, right? And you looked at the stat right here, the top 2% in the United States make over $400,000 per year with a net worth of 2.4 million, and their assets just keep increasing. Whereas the people at the bottom are just scraping by. Whether you are in education or you're in public service, you don't make anything, right? You're doing this and you're hoping that one day maybe you can retire comfortably, but if you want to make money, generally speaking, you're going into fields like technology and STEM and stuff like that. But if you're in public service and education and you're trying to be kind of a hero, there's going to be a gap. even if you're doing these positions that should be heralded as such. And in justice system inequality, the notion that if the elite and wealthy control the justice system, they can preserve political, economic, racial, and ethnic domination. This leads us to racial profiling and discriminatory sentences, because racial profiling does exist. I keep saying it, and I've said it in another class that I'm lecturing on over the summer and during this time period. At the end of the day, understand that racial profiling is real. And when looking at racial profiling, right, what I want you to know and want you to be aware of is that it's not because it's real because I said it. It's not because it's real because you saw Reverend Al Sharpton or somebody else out there saying it. It's real because the data says it, right? Criminologists, people who are black, white, Asian, any other ethnicity, do the data, and they say that there is an inequality in the justice system. In fact, more often than not, they're the ones, people of the opposite race are the ones bringing this to the attention. Go figure. So understand that the data supports it, right? And that's one of the reasons why contemporary critical criminology is gaining some steam. So how do we define crime and justice? Well, for some, especially under this ideal, crime is a political concept designed to protect the power and position of the upper class at the expense of the poor. In order to control crime, societies must remove the social conditions that promote crime. If crime is a political concept, right, then we have to argue and say, well, can't we start looking at our politicians? Can't we start questioning the ideals and the belief of our politicians, right? And so this is where the controversy lies. But also it's the belief that it's done to protect the power and position of the upper class. Now, what I would argue is, just me talking straight, is that the upper class are never going to be threatened by the poor or even the middle class, right? Because the upper class, again, take Elon Musk, take Jeff Bezos, take anyone you want to name. They are never going to lose their wealth. Warren Buffett, the only way they would lose their wealth is if the stock market crashed. That's probably the only way. They're not going to lose their wealth, no matter how many times people boycott or revolt their products. Understanding that, for critical criminologists, they look at it differently. They say, no. Crime is a political concept. In other words, these people are the power brokers and the movers and shakers, and they're moving chess pieces around because they want to protect themselves. Again, very controversial. It just all depends on where you follow the data and who are they aligned with, especially when it comes to political ambitions. So if we focus on the cause of crime, like what actually causes crime? Well, we have two ideals. We have the surplus value, profits produced by laboring classes that are accrued by business owners. Think about a surplus, right? You go, you get your paycheck, you have XYZ bills to pay, and then you pay everything, and then you look and say, wow, I still have, I'm just saying, I have $200 left. That's a surplus, right? It's better than a deficit, But when looking at why people engage in crime, because we're focusing on the wealthy, the elite, business owners, people trying to protect their bottom line, there's this belief that, okay, for these people at the top to stay enriched, they're going to include cost-cutting mechanisms or pay staff minimal salaries to keep the money at the top. When I lectured on this in person, I used to have plenty of students be like, yeah, Professor Fields, I work as a waitress or a server or whatever, and I'm making $2 or $3 an hour. And I'm like, are you serious? And they're like, no. What it is that they can get away with paying us such a wage because they try to argue, oh, no. You'll make up what a normal person making $8, $9, $10 an hour gets because of your tips. And then they've been like, Professor Fields, I've had people that tip very poorly. They tip $1 or $2 on, maybe a $30, $40, $50 meal. So we don't, it's not the same. But like I said, I was like, could you imagine if name your favorite restaurant, if they started saying, nah, we're going to pay people a flat minimum wage salary and they can keep the tips. No, because that takes away from the people at the top. They want to be living life. So that's the surplus value. On the other hand, we have marginalization. And marginalization is what we're experiencing now, a lot of. People being thrust outside the economic mainstream. In some instances, think about how, some people are forced to live in areas that have high crime. Not everyone can afford some of the high rents or the high costs of homes that are being built. I just said in the last lecture, if you skipped this and didn't listen to the last lecture, well, you need to go back and listen to that lecture. But with that being said, I just shared that when I took my son and his two friends to a church pool party last night in a metro suburb, more affluent area of metro Atlanta, here in Georgia, they said new homes starting at $900,000. Now, again, I don't know where you live. I don't live in a $900,000 house. And so with that being said, recognize that people feel marginalized. They feel like, who's affording these $900,000 houses? And yes, somebody can buy them. Absolutely. But you're like, do I know anybody that can just purchase a $900,000 house? Think about that. When looking at inflation and the high cost of living, people feel marginalized. They feel like they're not in the economic mainstream. In fact, they're outside of the economic mainstream. Educational disparities play a key role as well. We last chapter in social process theories, we talked about those bonds. Think about the peers. Think about education. Think about your parents. Maybe if you have a relationship with religious organizations. Well, the same thing goes in terms of educational disparities. Schools in poverty-stricken inner city neighborhoods, they do very poorly, and they are oftentimes considered failures. In fact, schools that are considered failures are viewed as what's called dropout factories. Those are schools in which 60% of the students don't finish high school. Could you imagine? 60% of the students in that area don't even finish high school. So when you have school districts that are failing, what can you do? Well, what did I just say a few moments ago? I said if you work in public service, if you work in education, you don't get paid very well. So if you have schools that are F schools, how are you luring people into those schools? Now, yes, somebody will need a position. Somebody fresh out of college will need a job somewhere. And even though they'll be probably complaining about the low salary, but what's their motivation to turn people around? Well, some may say, you know what? It is what it is. I'm going to show these people that I'm worth more than what they're paying me and try their best to turn things around. But for others, they're going to say, hey, I'm just here just to get the experience and then I'm out the door. So educational disparities exist because when we have schools in low inner city neighborhoods, generally speaking, they do poorly right away. And then we have two theories. We have the instrumental theory versus the structural theory. When we look at the instrumental theory, the criminal law and criminal justice system are capitalist instruments for controlling the lower class. Those who wield economic power can extend their self-serving definition of illegal or criminal behavior to stop those who might threaten their profits. Under this theory, basically the poor may or may not commit more crimes than the rich, but they are arrested and punished more. So with instrumental theory, the criminal justice system is a tool for the wealthy and for the elite. You see all these people sitting around the table, grabbing money and whatnot. And again, I know it's just an illustration, but generally speaking, the feeling is, hey, we're doing stuff. We don't know how, you don't know how they got that money, and we're not going to be punished because we use this system to go after the poor and those that are disadvantaged. That's instrumental theory. What I love is this theory, structural theory. And this is where I come from as law enforcement. And this is why I preface, and I will say this again, so you will hear this in a few chapters, right? When it comes to the criminal justice system, I don't care who you are. When I took that oath from the sheriff back in 2012, right? 2012, it was like January, probably around January the 8th or 9th, somewhere around there, 2012. It doesn't matter who you are. If you break the law, you will pay the consequences the same. The sheriff said, I have had my own family members in this jail. We do not show favoritism, period. And I have taken that to heart. So I love structural theory because structural theory says that the criminal law and the criminal justice system are a means of defending and preserving the capitalist system. The laws are designed to keep the system operating efficiently, and anyone, no matter the socioeconomic status, will be targeted, will be sanctioned. Again, I don't care if you are a CEO, a judge, a sheriff, a businessman, a doctor, a trainer, a teacher, a priest, a leader. It doesn't matter who you are. An athlete, you will be punished the same. You make $1 million a year, you're still punished. You make $100,000 a year, you're still punished. You only make $10,000 a year, you're still punished. That's how it's supposed to be. And I love structural theory because that's the mindset that we had on day one. And that's the mindset I had on day one when the sheriff swore me in. In fact, long prison sentences are given to corporate executives who practice insider trading as a warning that everyone must play by the rules. You can't go ahead and get insider trading or insider stock knowledge and then go ahead and quickly sell your stocks while everyone else lose their money and you're sitting pretty and everyone else is struggling. Absolutely not. When the government finds out, when the SEC, Securities and Exchange Committee, finds out that you did that, you're going to prison. So I love this statement, and you might want to jot it down. No man is above the law, and no man is below it, nor do we ask any man's permission when we ask him to obey it. President Theodore Roosevelt. Let that sink in. Nobody's above the law. Doesn't matter how wealthy you are, how powerful you are. Now, there may be some instances that you may be reading this or listening to this lecture. You might say, well, Professor Fields, I don't know. There are people who've beaten charges, and yes, there are. There are people who have had the best lawyers, the best tactics, and sometimes they have had so much power that they did escape. But generally speaking, no man is above the law. And we don't ask any man's permission when we ask him to obey it or follow it. So keep that in mind. I love this quote by President Theodore Roosevelt. So looking at alternative views of critical theory, is criminal justice even-handed? In other words, do we look at the criminal justice system and say, okay, do people that are convicted of a crime, do they tend to get stricter sentences if their personal characteristics show them to be members of dangerous classes? If you have somebody that appears to be a single, young, urban male, maybe doesn't come from the greatest family, do they get a stricter sentence? Now, we don't necessarily have any data to support that, but we know that if you have a more clean-cut, a person that comes from a super affluent family, in fact, we know sometimes names carry weight. I mean, just come on, you can name anybody that is very well-known, prominent, and you just throw out their name and say, okay, if their kid got in trouble, they're going to be like, wait, you are blah, blah, blah. Oh, yeah, that carries weight. My alma mater, there was a quarterback at my alma mater, blew me away because at our gang intel conference, I'm still a member of the Gang Investigators Association. I was talking to our president and I was like, dude, did you see this? And it turns out that the quarterback who would have been the quarterback of the future for the program, dad played in the NFL, had a long NFL career. He got arrested on child pornography charges. Now, I wish I was still in law enforcement because I would have absolutely read that police report. But he got arrested on child pornography charges. Do you know those charges went away? That all he pled to was like child endangerment and disorderly conduct. That's it. Moved back to Texas. He withdrew from the university, moved back to Texas. Life goes on. But I said, if that was me, if that was the president of our association, if that was probably virtually everybody in that conference room, and it was at least 500 people in there, we would have been under the jail. Sometimes your name carries weight. Sometimes your characteristics and skill carry weight. So when looking at race and justice, there is the racial threat hypothesis. That argues that as the number of minority group members in a community increases, law enforcement agents become more punitive. There's a push for more law and order. Even though we know crime rates are declining, there's this idea that we have to have law and order. And so with the racial threat hypothesis, the belief is that as long as we have more minorities, we got to be a lot more strict when it comes to giving out justice. Now, critical race theory. Critical race theory can be very controversial, but we're talking about it from the context and the lens of criminology, right? It's a theoretical position and political movement that holds that the concept of race is not a natural biological reality, but a created concept designed to oppress and exploit people of color. Essentially, what we have here is that within critical race theory, people feel that the law and legal institutions are inherently racist. They function to create and maintain social, economic, and political control of racial minorities, and it's done at the benefit of the white majority. Now, again, my argument with respect to critical race theory is that people don't have to listen to what individuals say with respect to race. What they can do is they can look at the data. Critical race theory is gaining some steam, some traction and some steam when it comes as an alternate view of critical theory. But I don't think that we can dismiss race in criminology. We don't have to always talk about it, but we can certainly view it as plausible because the data supports how many people of minority groups are incarcerated, how many people of minority groups have criminal charges, etc. So we have to at least look at the data. We also have critical feminist theory. Explains both victimization and criminality among women in terms of gender, inequality, patriarchy, and exploitation of women under capitalism. With critical feminist theory, there's this belief and notion that women are seen as less than. In other words, in terms of their inequality, I want to say out of the Fortune 500, which is top 500 companies in the world, the Fortune 500, I think out of the 500 companies, only maybe about 40 to 45 of the CEOs of those companies are women. So we're not even talking 10%. We're talking, essentially 8-9% of the companies are run by women. Everything else is run by men. And then when you get minority women, that number is even smaller. It's probably like maybe 2 or 3. So for some, people feel like as long as women make certain inroads on their progress, getting leadership roles, jobs, etc., some people argue and feel that they are more likely to be exploited and victimized just because of their success by being a woman. Now, power control theory. Crime and delinquency are functions of class position. Position is power, and family functions control. And it links between two variables within the family. So one, parents produce or reproduce a power relationship they hold in the workplace. That's a position of dominance. And then as a result, their work experiences and class position influence the criminality of children. So if they're domineering, if they're like the micromanager, super controlling person at work, well, they're probably going to be the same way at home. And that's going to alienate children. But that's the whole premise behind power control theory. Queer criminology is gaining some steam as well. With respect to queer criminology, because we have become more, our society has been more open. In fact, you just hear we're in June. This is Pride Month. Critical scholars focused on the treatment of people in the LGBTQ population, and what they discussed was how damaging stereotypes and representations of people as sexual deviants develop. See, many people will argue that a person in this community is sexually deviant, they're a predator, they're a pedophile. Like they've given them labels. In fact, it's labeling theory, right? They've given them labeling. And so people in this community are often painted in a negative light. I've talked to people in this community. I've heard from students. I've heard from people in general. And they're like, we are some of the people that you don't have to worry about. We're just here wanting equality. We want to, be okay with our partner. We're not going after a person who is not into us. So stop with that stereotype. But we just want to have equal footing in society. That's all. Yet with queer criminology, there's the belief and idea that, yes, some people will paint them as sexual deviants. They're predators and they're lurking in the shadows trying to snatch people or snatch children or act a certain way. How does the criminal justice system respond to when people in this population get arrested or fall into the system or are victimized? Will the system show them the same level of respect as they would as a heterosexual person? And then, of course, there's peacemaking criminology. And the purpose of peacemaking criminology is to promote a peaceful and just society. I wish that we just had peace around the world. No conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Everything was okay between Israel and the people of Palestine could rebuild and live in peace and harmony. We don't have any other conflicts or any wars or battles or anything. But that's never going to happen. We're always going to have conflict, right? So with peacemaking criminology, people are coming together in the criminal justice system trying to find conflict resolution, being able to work through differences to prevent and control crime rather than just focusing on punishment and sending people to prison. In fact, the argument is that punitive crime measures are counterproductive. Punishing people and putting people, locking them up and throwing away the key is never the answer. Yes, they have to deal with punishment. They have to pay a price for the crime they committed. But a feeling and argument is, can we be different? Can we find a way to, try to impact change without just throwing someone away, without just locking someone up, right? And that's where the punitive crime control strategies sometimes that are seen as ineffective come into question. So that gives us our last topic, and that's restorative justice. So the concept of restorative justice is that it focuses on needs of victims, community, and offenders. All three parties come together. Generally speaking, the criminal justice system is only really focused on the offender because we got to punish the offender for doing something wrong. The victim does have play, but generally in any avenue or facet of the system, the victim is an afterthought. That's why we have victimology. That's why we have the discipline of victimology. The star of that show is the victim. But in this case, with restorative justice, we do want to bring all parties together. And we want to do it in a non-punitive strategy to heal wounds caused by crime. So what restorative justice does is that it focuses on holding offenders accountable, and they acknowledge the harm that they caused to the victim. This is the key. You have to understand that you caused a harm to the victim. If you can't understand that, if you can't accept that, if you can't even acknowledge that, then for all intents and purposes, it is not going to work. It's not even going to be a thought, because you have to realize, I did you a harm, I'm sorry, and I want to make amends for it. So one way of doing this is something called reintegrative shaming. Shame is what we feel when we don't meet the standards we set for ourselves or that significant others have set for us. So when a child does something wrong and the parent says, I'm disappointed in you, that's devastating to a child, because no child wants to hear they disappointed their parent, right? Especially if they hold their parents in high regard. And if the parents hold that child in high regard. Shame is a very powerful tool. Well, the same thing goes here in terms of criminality. If we let down people in our society, we got arrested, an article's written on our arrest, we've let somebody down. There's not one person that ever got arrested or will get arrested that didn't let somebody down. Even if they had lost a majority of their family members, somebody knows who that person is that got arrested. And they're going to be like, man, I'm disappointed. It let me down. I didn't think he would do that, right? I didn't think she would do that. Now, shame has two distinct characteristics. One, the stigmatization. Stigmatization. That's where you brand a person as evil or an outcast. Think about a person who is branded as a sex offender, has to go on a sex offender registration. Being a sex offender is degrading. Again, no excuse for the commission of the crime, but certainly to me, it's always seen as a scarlet letter, because you can still live a decent life, but you can't live the best life you could have lived because you're going to have restrictions, right? So being stigmatized, being branded, being labeled, that's social reaction labeling theory. And then, of course, reintegrative shaming, which also, is what this is all about. And that's a method of correction that encourages offenders to confront their misdeeds, experience shame because of the harm they cause, and then be re-included in society. So you say, hi, my name is Joe, and I'm an alcoholic, and I'm here to get help. And everybody says, hi, Joe, welcome, or whatever. Like if you go through, 12 steps or one of those different programs. But you're saying out loud, I am an alcoholic and I need help. I am a gambler and I need help. I'm a compulsive liar and I need help. It's hard to say that, right? It's hard to say it in a group setting, but you're saying it amongst people who have the same struggles that you have. So that's where shame comes into play. Now, the process of restoration, generally speaking, it redefines crime as conflict among offender, victim, and affected constituencies. The offender has to recognize that he or she caused the injury. That's the other key. So not only do they have to recognize they caused harm, but they have to also recognize they caused an injury. Again, that's the key. Restoration involves turning the justice system into a healing process rather than being the distributor of retribution and revenge. We often associate the criminal justice system as being punitive, which it is. Let me tell you something. I've taught in criminal justice, I've taught juvenile justice. I have to remind people that with juvenile justice, it's rehabilitative, right? It's designed to treat offenders, or in this case, delinquents, which are children. The criminal justice system is squarely punitive. However, there has been a shift over the last few years to make the criminal justice system be a little bit more rehabilitative without losing its identity, of course. So with restoration, there's this belief that, okay, well, we, in the process of turning it into a rehabilitative approach, we also want to heal. We want to heal people, right? And in the course of healing people, we're not so focused on retribution and revenge. We're changing the narrative of what the system is. So within restorative justice, there are there's two notable circles. One is the sentencing circle. The other is the peacemaking circle. But for the purposes of this class and lecture, we're focusing on the sentencing circle. The sentencing circle is a technique in which offenders, victims, and other community members are brought together to formulate a sanction that addresses the needs of all. So a sentencing circle is embraced in law enforcement, some law enforcement agencies, not all, but some, communities, schools, and even the courts. And basically everyone's coming together. They're going to sit around. You're going to have members of the community, you're going to have the victim, you're going to have the offender, you're going to have maybe some court personnel, and they're going to say what is going to be a sanction that addresses the need for all. Give you a prime example. A great sanction would be, let's say you had an individual who, let's say they vandalized and destroyed property. And let's say they broke into, or let's say they broke into like a restaurant or a business, a convenience store or something. They broke the window, busted up the place, got away, but they were caught. Well, as a primary sentencing circle could involve the offender realizing they were wrong and they made a mistake, why they did it, and the victim saying, I forgive you and I'm willing to, have myself be made whole. And the community can say, well, why are you doing this? It made people feel unsafe. So what might happen is the offender and everyone might agree to, okay, he's going to do or she's going to do restitution to pay for the glass repair. He's also or she's also going to come down to the area and is going to go business to business telling people I was the one who did this, but I'm very apologetic and sorry for how this made you feel because one of your fellow business owners or shop owners experience a break-in, and I want to also help you whether it's I can pass out flyers, whether it's just volunteering once a week here at your store, whatever. But I want to assure you that this type of behavior was unacceptable and I'm apologizing. Something like that. But it's for everybody. So the other stores, they get a benefit too. And the offender gets a benefit that they are righting the wrong for what they did, including paying the restitution and maybe helping the store owner. And then the store owner gets a benefit because they get compensated for the victimization and they get additional assistance. But that's what a sentencing circle does. Everybody comes together and agrees on what is a sanction that addresses the needs for all. So reconciliation is this whole process of, putting your differences aside and coming together. You're reconciling your differences, reconciling your conflict. You do understand that conflict between both parties exists, but you're addressing those issues instead of treating one person like the victim and the other person like the suspect or offender. So essentially, we're reconciling our differences. We're putting them behind us. Yes, you did do what you did, and I'm not, I'm upset that you did it, but I've forgiven you for it, and we're okay. And yes, I am, I did you wrong. I broke the law, whatever, but I'm sorry for what I did. I want to apologize about it, and I want to make you whole. Like, we're coming together to bury the hatchet. Bury the hatchet, right? We're reconciling our differences, and we are coming together to bury the hatchet. We're making peace with one another. And if we are in the process of making peace with one another, it's buried. I don't have to make you feel like, there's that criminal that broke into my place. There you go. Hi. There's the guy I got to pay this restitution to because I did them wrong. Reconciliation. We are making peace with one another. So what about the challenges? What about the challenge of restorative justice? We get ready to wrap this up. Well, for some state that, is it a political movement? Is this a nice liberal alternative? Because the liberals, the lefties are soft on crime and we are hard on crime, right? I mean, it takes all parties getting involved. You got people in the criminal justice arena that are left, right, or independent. So some people saying it's a liberal movement or liberal alternative are misinformed. You got to be wary of cultural and social differences. In other words, what might be restorative in some circles could be insulting in others. Some people are going to be like, man, this person better get out of my face because I don't give a flip what they did and how they want to make this right. The bottom line is that they did me wrong. They had no business doing me wrong. So this is very insulting. We're going to sit around and talk like everything's good. They harmed me, right? There's also no single definition of what constitutes restorative justice. Yes, it is an idea where the offender recognizes the harm that they caused and they're coming together to make the victim whole. But in some cases, restorative justice could simply mean, hey, the individual recognizes they did a wrong. However, in our particular, circuit, unit, county, whatever, it means they recognize they did wrong and they're just going to make and pay back the person, give up an apology, and move on. We're not going to do all this. Let's come together and sit down and talk because we don't have time for that. Balancing the needs of offenders and victims. Again, what if the victim feels forgotten? What if there's people are sorry that the offender did it? Sometimes people will be like, how are you making excuses for this behavior? Hello, I'm the victim here. Why are you saying sorry that you were failed? Sorry that, you did what you did. No, you need to be sorry to me for doing what you did, not we are apologizing to you for your actions. And then lastly, the benefits may work only in the short term while ignoring long-term treatment needs. Once again, people will do, and I've seen this, having worked in the criminal justice field for 15 years, I have seen people do the bare minimum to get it over with. The second it's over, I remember one time I terminated someone on probation. They literally said, all right, Officer Fields, I am going to smoke 3 blunts tonight. And I'm like, you just completed a drug program. You just completed drug court. What do you mean? Oh, I'm just playing. And they seem very serious, right? Some people will only do the bare minimum at the short term because it's not going to address long-term issues or long-term needs. So we're going to stop there. I certainly want to thank you for tuning in to this lecture examining social conflict, critical criminology, and restorative justice. Again, be sure to continue to follow along as we are progressing through. We are making great progress. We only have, if my memory serves me correctly, about 5 more chapters to go at this point. So be sure to check out our next and final chapter on our block of theories, which looks at life course, propensity, and trajectory, or developmental theories. So thank you for listening. Stay safe, and I'll see you next time.